Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back in time where the echoes of history whisper their secrets to soothe your mind. Tonight, we travel to the frost-kissed streets of Victorian London, where the winter's embrace was far harsher than many of us could imagine today. As you settle in, perhaps drawing your blanket closer, allow the gentle current of history to carry you toward peaceful slumber. This tale of winter's brutal grip on 19th century London is designed to help you unwind, to distance yourself from the pressures of modern life as you drift into restful contemplation of times long past. The rhythmic cadence of history often provides the perfect backdrop for relaxation. I'm always curious to know where in our global community you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling in for the evening in Sydney, catching a midday break in New York, or finding a moment of morning calm in London itself. Please share in the comments where you are and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how this community of history enthusiasts spans across continents and time zones. If you find these historical journeys help ease you into peaceful rest, consider subscribing so you won't miss future tales from the tapestry of human experience. Each story is carefully crafted to transport you to another time while gently guiding you toward tranquility. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and central heating of our modern existence and step back into the winter of 1840, when London faced one of the most merciless seasons in living memory. The bitter wind swept down the narrow lanes of London, carrying with it the first whispers of what would become known as the Great Frost. December had arrived with unusual ferocity, the temperature plummeting so rapidly that the mighty Thames, the lifeblood of London commerce, began to surrender to winter's grip. Day by day, the flowing water slowed, ice forming first along the banks in delicate crystalline patterns, then stretching outward like frozen fingers reaching for the opposite shore. "Never seen the like," muttered old Mr. Finch, a grizzled waterman who had plied the river for 40 years, his weathered face creasing with concern as he watched his livelihood solidify before his eyes. "Not since I was a boy in the century's first decade." In the cramped attic room of a crumbling tenement in Seven Dials, 12-year-old Thomas Wilkins curled himself tighter beneath the thin blanket he shared with two younger siblings. His narrow chest still ached from the day's work, lungs burning from hours spent crawling through the sooty chimneys of Mayfair's elegant townhouses. "Just a bit closer, Lil," he whispered to his 7-year-old sister, whose small body provided precious warmth against his back. "Morning comes soon enough." But even as he spoke these words of reassurance, Thomas knew that morning would bring little relief. The room's small hearth remained cold and empty. Coal had become as precious as gold since the freeze began, its price rising beyond what even his meager earnings could afford. By the week's end, the Thames had transformed completely. What had once been a bustling waterway of commerce now stretched like a vast white plain through the heart of London. The silence was eerie. No splash of oars, no calls of boatmen, no creak of heavily laden barges. Instead, tentative footsteps began to venture onto the ice, first near the banks, then bolder steps toward the center. "It'll hold a regiment now," declared a former soldier, stomping his boot firmly on the frozen surface. "Solid as the tower itself." And indeed, as if summoned by this proclamation, London's population began to reclaim the river in a most unexpected way. While Thomas and countless other children from London's eastern parishes huddled together for warmth, a very different scene unfolded upon the frozen Thames. Wealthy merchants and their families, dressed in furs and fine wool, descended onto the ice with servants carrying chairs, tables, and braziers filled with glowing coals. "A proper frost fair!" exclaimed Sir William Harrington to his delighted wife and daughters as they watched workers erect a large tent on the ice near Westminster. "Just like in the old days my father spoke of." Within hours, the frozen river hosted a carnival atmosphere. Makeshift shops selling hot gingerbread and mulled wine, skaters gliding gracefully between impromptu cricket matches, even a printer who set up his press to sell souvenir cards commemorating the Great Frost of 1840. In the East End, Thomas rose before dawn, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air of the attic. "Mind your back before dark," his mother cautioned, her face gaunt with worry as she pressed a crust of bread into his palm, their last food until he brought home his day's earnings. "They say it'll be colder yet tonight." Thomas nodded, swallowing his hunger as he wrapped a tattered scarf around his neck and face. The streets were eerily quiet as he made his way toward the homes of the wealthy, where at least the chimneys would provide some warmth while he worked. He passed a coal merchant's yard where a crowd had gathered, their faces desperate. "10 shillings a bag," the merchant announced, to groans and curses from the assembled poor. "Take it or leave it. Thames is frozen solid. No barges coming through." Thomas hurried past, knowing that such prices meant many more would die before winter released its grip on London. That afternoon, as Thomas emerged, soot-covered from his third chimney of the day, he caught sight of something extraordinary through an upper window. Far below on the frozen Thames, hundreds of well-dressed Londoners strolled across the ice as if it were Hyde Park on a summer's day. A full roast ox turned on a spit, the scent of cooking meat rising tantalizingly on the cold air. Musicians played while couples danced, their laughter carrying clearly in the winter stillness. "Boy, back to work." The sharp voice of the housekeeper broke his reverie. "That chimney in the nursery won't sweep itself." Thomas turned away from the window, the contrast between the revelry on the ice and his own circumstances settling like a weight in his empty stomach. As he gathered his brushes and rods, he wondered if those celebrating on the Thames ever thought about the thousands freezing in the warren of streets just beyond their sight. As December descended upon London, the great frost gave way to something equally sinister. A thick, yellowish fog began to creep through the streets, first as wisps that curled around lampposts, and then as an all-consuming blanket that swallowed entire neighborhoods. This was no ordinary winter mist, but the infamous pea-souper that Londoners had come to dread, a noxious combination of natural fog and the relentless coal smoke belching from thousands of chimneys across the city. By midday, it had transformed into a poisonous yellow-black darkness that turned noon to dusk and dusk to impenetrable night. "Cover your mouth, Thomas," his mother whispered, tying a thin cloth around his face as he prepared to venture out. Her own breathing came in labored wheezes, the weeks of cold having settled deep in her chest. "The sweet master will expect you, fog or no fog." She pressed a small crust of bread into his palm, their last morsel until his day's wages came home. Thomas nodded, knowing that missing work meant no coal, and no coal meant they might not survive another night of the merciless cold. Outside, the world had disappeared. Thomas could barely see his own feet as he shuffled forward, one hand trailing along building walls to keep his bearings. The familiar streets of Seven Dials had become a labyrinth of shadows where disembodied coughs and footsteps echoed from unseen passers-by. The fog had a taste, sulphurous and greasy, that coated his tongue despite the cloth covering his face. It stung his eyes and scratched at his lungs with each breath, adding to the constant irritation caused by months of chimney soot. Across town in Whitechapel, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell moved briskly through the overcrowded workhouse infirmary, her skirts sweeping against rows of makeshift beds that lined every available wall. "More steam, if you please," she instructed an assistant, who hurried to add water to the kettles positioned strategically around the room. The humid air provided some small relief to the dozens of patients struggling for breath, their lungs ravaged by what locals called fog fever. Dr. Blackwell, an American-trained physician who had fought prejudice at every turn to practice medicine, now fought an equally relentless enemy in the winter illnesses claiming London's most vulnerable. "The third bed from the window, doctor," called a harried nurse. "The child's fever has worsened." Elizabeth moved to the bedside of a girl no older than 6, her small chest heaving with effort, lips tinged an alarming blue despite the heat of her skin. "Pneumonia," Elizabeth murmured, recognizing the telltale rattle. She had seen 15 such cases since morning, and it was not yet 2 o'clock. "Prepare a mustard plaster, and bring me the willow bark tincture," she ordered, knowing even as she spoke that, for many, these remedies would prove insufficient against the fog's deadly embrace. The workhouse windows, grimy at the best of times, now showed only a solid wall of yellow-brown murk that pressed against the glass like a living thing seeking entry. But the fog needed no invitation. It seeped through every crack and crevice, bringing its poison into the very place where the sick sought refuge. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter, suppressing a cough of her own. The coal supply for the infirmary was dangerously low, the donation from the parish board having been smaller than promised. Again. Miles away in Mayfair, even the grand homes of London's elite could not escape the fog's intrusion. Lady Margaret Harrington stood at her dressing-room window, unable to see the ornate garden that lay just 20 feet beyond. Behind her, a maid carefully folded her husband's winter garments, thick woolen coats, scarves of the finest cashmere, gloves lined with rabbit fur, all laid out for her inspection. "Sarah," Lady Margaret said quietly, "have Lord Harrington's old coats been prepared as I requested?" "Yes, my lady," the maid replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The footman believes his lordship is at his club until evening." She hesitated before adding, "Cook says the fog is thicker than she's ever seen. Perhaps another day would be wiser." Lady Margaret turned from the window, her normally serene face set with determination. "Children are freezing tonight, Sarah. Another day might be too late for some." She had seen them herself during her charity committee visits. Tiny bodies, huddled in doorways, wrapped in nothing but rags, their fingers and toes turning the alarming white of frostbite. Her husband, a prominent member of Parliament, spoke eloquently about the plight of the poor, but balked at any suggestion of personal sacrifice. What he didn't know about his diminishing wardrobe wouldn't harm him, she reasoned, but might save lives. As darkness fell, though in truth the difference between day and night had become academic in the fog's stranglehold, Lady Margaret slipped out through the servants' entrance, a bundle wrapped in plain cloth tucked under her arm. Her lady's maid followed with a similar package, both women wearing the simplest dresses they owned. They moved like ghosts through the thick air, guided by the occasional glow of gas lamps that created eerie halos in the darkness. Their destination was a small church in St. Giles, where Lady Margaret knew dozens of street children sought nightly shelter. The fog muffled all sound, creating an unsettling silence broken only by distant coughs and the occasional clatter of an unseen carriage moving at walking pace, its driver calling out continuously to warn pedestrians. "Stay close, Sarah," Lady Margaret whispered, reaching back to ensure her maid hadn't been swallowed by the impenetrable murk. "We're nearly there." Inside the church, the air was scarcely clearer than outside, the fog having infiltrated through ancient windows and under-worn doors. But candles burned at the altar, providing just enough light to reveal rows of small figures, huddled in pews, wrapped in whatever scraps they had managed to scavenge. Lady Margaret moved among them, quietly distributing her husband's fine wool coats and scarves, cutting some into smaller pieces to serve more children. "This will keep the cold at bay," she murmured to a hollow-eyed boy who reminded her painfully of Thomas, the young sweep she had glimpsed working in her neighbor's home just days earlier. As Lady Margaret worked, the church door creaked open, admitting another swirl of fog and a slight figure clutching a cloth to his face. Thomas Wilkins stumbled in, exhausted after a day of navigating London's transformed landscape having earned just enough for a small bag of coal, but finding no vendors able to make deliveries through the blinding fog. Seeing nowhere else to turn, he had sought shelter where he knew other children sometimes gathered. He stopped short at the sight of the fine lady distributing clothing, momentarily afraid he had intruded on some private charity event where street children like him would be unwelcome. But then Lady Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his across the dim church interior. For a moment, recognition flickered across her face, not of Thomas specifically, but of what he represented. One of London's countless invisible children, bearing the weight of winter's cruelty on impossibly thin shoulders. She beckoned him forward, holding out the last of her treasures, a thick cashmere scarf that would fetch a week's coal if sold, or perhaps save a life if kept. "For you," she said simply, pressing it into his blackened hands. "The fog may linger, but it cannot last forever." The February thaw came suddenly, as if winter had grown weary of its own cruelty. Thomas awoke one morning to an unfamiliar sound, a steady dripping from the ceiling, water seeping through the worn plaster in dark, expanding stains. The cashmere scarf Lady Margaret had given him remained wrapped around his neck even as he slept, a treasure he refused to part with despite offers from local pawnbrokers. "Ma," he called, nudging his mother who lay coughing on their shared pallet. "The ice is breaking." Outside their window, the world had transformed overnight. The Thames, so recently a solid expanse where the wealthy had danced and feasted, was now a churning mass of fractured ice sheets and swirling currents. The sound was tremendous, cracking, groaning, and splashing as the river reclaimed itself. But what initially seemed a blessing quickly revealed itself as yet another of London's winter torments. By midday, the narrow streets of Jacob's Island and other riverside slums had become shallow canals of filthy water. "Get what you can off the floor!" shouted Mrs. Finch from the room below, her voice tight with panic. Thomas helped his mother to her feet as water began seeping through the floorboards. Not clean meltwater, but a foul mixture carrying the winter's accumulated waste. The stench was overwhelming, sewage and rot rising from beneath their feet as the Thames pushed back against the city that had constrained it. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, helping his mother gather their few possessions. Throughout their building, similar scenes unfolded. Families abandoning ground floor rooms, carrying children and meager belongings to higher ground. In the street below, a cart had been commandeered to ferry the elderly through knee-deep water. "The church," his mother suggested between coughs. St. Giles might still be dry." The journey was arduous, the February air still biting despite the thaw. Thomas supported his mother's weight as they navigated streets where ice and filthy water created treacherous passage. Others joined their procession, a silent, determined exodus from the flooding riverside tenements. "Mind the little ones," called an older man as a group of children splashed dangerously close to an open sewer grate. "That current'll take you before you can scream." St. Giles Church stood on higher ground, its doors thrown open to the displaced. But Thomas and his mother continued past it, drawn by the smell of something they'd nearly forgotten: hot food. In 7 Dials, where 7 streets converged in a chaotic junction, smoke rose from a makeshift kitchen established in what had once been a failed millinery shop. "Come on, then," called a stout woman, stirring an enormous pot. "No one goes hungry today." The woman was Mrs. Hodges, who normally ran a small apple cart and was known for her fierce territorial disputes with other vendors. Yet here she stood alongside Mr. Perkins, the butcher who had chased her from his corner more than once. "Extraordinary times," Mr. Perkins explained, noticing Thomas's surprise as he handed him 2 bowls of steaming soup. "The flood's taken his shop same as my storeroom. Might as well feed folks with what we salvaged." The soup kitchen had emerged almost spontaneously, a collective response to shared suffering. Factory workers contributed portions of their wages. Street vendors donated what inventory they could save. And even a few servants from grander homes arrived with surplus from their masters' kitchens. Surplus that had clearly been deliberately set aside rather than truly excess. "Lady Margaret sent these," whispered a maid as she slipped Thomas an extra bread roll. "Said to look for the boy with her husband's scarf." Days passed, and the waters gradually receded, leaving behind a thick layer of foul-smelling mud and debris. The damage was extensive. Foundations weakened, possessions ruined, and disease spreading through dampened dwellings. Yet something unexpected had emerged from the crisis. The soup kitchen remained, now operating from a proper storefront offered by a landlord whose conscience had finally overcome his ledger. "We've managed this long," Mrs. Hodges declared. "Might as well continue until proper spring arrives." Thomas found himself with unexpected purpose. His small size and chimney-climbing skills made him valuable for assessing damage in tight spaces, and soon he was earning steady wages, helping to rebuild damaged homes. "Mind that beam," he called down to Mr. Carpenter, the ironically named mason who had taken Thomas under his wing. "It's rotted clean through. We'll need to sister it before the ceiling comes down." As March arrived, bringing tentative sunshine and the first green buds on trees in the parks, Thomas walked home with actual coins jingling in his pocket. The winter had been brutal beyond memory. The freezing Thames, the poisonous fog, the filthy floods. Yet he had survived. More than survived. He had found something like purpose. "You're looking hardier," his mother remarked one evening, her own cough finally subsiding. "There's color in your face I haven't seen since autumn." "It's good work," Thomas replied, setting his tools by the door. "Mr. Carpenter says I have a gift for seeing what others miss. Says I might make a proper builder someday." He didn't mention how the winter's lessons stayed with him, how he now understood that London's seeming solidity was an illusion, that beneath the grand facades lay vulnerability that crossed all boundaries of wealth and station. The frozen river had been both barrier and bridge. The fog had choked mansions and hovels alike, and the floods had reminded everyone that nature recognized no social distinctions. On the first truly warm day of spring, Thomas took his mother to see the Thames, now flowing freely between its banks. Boats moved up and down the river, commerce resuming its eternal rhythm. "Hard to believe it was solid enough to walk on," his mother mused, leaning on his arm. Thomas nodded, fingering the cashmere scarf he still wore despite the warming weather. "Winter will come again," he said, not with dread, but with the calm certainty of one who had learned to prepare, rather than merely endure. "But so will spring, always does."